Hello and welcome to another episode of the Transection podcast. If you joined us last week for my conversation with Jordan about euphoria and how important and marvellous that is, thank you for listening. If not, you can catch up anytime at your leisure. They're not going anywhere. This week for this episode, I was joined by Amanda Wells and we had a really lovely conversation about trauma and PTSD. I know that sounds maybe like an oxymoron. How can we have a lovely conversation about trauma and PTSD? But that's the healing part of it, isn't it? Sharing things and overcoming and healing and sharing our stories of improving things and getting better, because that's what we want for everybody, really. Amanda is a counsellor and psychotherapist. She's really magic. I mentioned in an earlier episode that Amanda helped me out with my own PTSD that I'd lived with for 20 years. So we'll cover that a little bit. Amanda has worked privately with clients and also for lots of different charities, Heart's Mind Network, Mind, and the New Leaf College, doing wellbeing courses for mental health charities. She's ended up specialising in mental health, trauma and PTSD, and she's currently undertaking her studies for her Masters in Traumatology and PTSD treatment. So she really, really knows her stuff, and she's so lovely as well. I think even if you don't hear every word that she says, you'll still be lulled into a sense of calm just by her lovely voice. So I hope you enjoy it. It is obviously it's a heavy subject, but we try to approach it with gentleness and care and humour when it's appropriate. For those of you who are sensitive to these sorts of subjects, we do mention things like abuse, but we don't go into any particular details about those things. We just briefly give a gentle synopsis, but we don't get into any of the real heavy details or anything like that. So it should be all right. But just for those of you who are a bit sensitive to this subject, just exercise your listening habits with caution and just look after yourself. But it should be helpful. This has been a really big thing for me, dealing with trauma, facing it and healing from it, and that takes a lot of courage, and it's really helped me to improve my life and move forward in a way that I didn't think possible. And I hope that by listening to this, people feel comforted and reassured that they're not on their own, and also that healing is possible. And Amanda and I talk about lots of different things in this, and she's also included some helpful tips and insights, because Amanda's dealt with trauma and PTSD herself as well, so this is not just an academic exploration for her. This is personal as well. So I hope you really enjoy it. If you want to share anything about your own issues or things that have helped you, you can tweet us at Transection P. You can also find us on Instagram, Transection Podcast, and on Facebook under the Transection Podcast. If you've not signed up already to our mailing list, you can do so at www.muxharrishill.com/transection, and then you'll get notifications when we release an episode every week, and any other bits that we might be doing that you might be interested in. We're not really spammy, it's not like every day or anything, but you don't want to miss out. This is top quality stuff. And if you would like some new info and fun things in your ear holes, then I would encourage you not to miss out and sign up if you haven't already. Enjoy. So Amanda, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
And tell us where you're from, Amanda, because you're off of Wales.
I am, yes. I came from a little village called Ystlavera, which is about 30 miles in from the Brecon Beacons, between the Brecon Beacons and Swansea, so right in the middle. Beautiful valley, lots of mountains, streams. The childhood was fantastic. In fact, I spent a lot of time up trees and up mountains playing in mine shafts and playing around coal tips and things like that. Fun stuff.
So it's sort of a bit like Sound of Music, but Welsh.
Yes, with a lot of sheep.
Yeah. When did you know that you were going to end up helping people?
I think that actually took many years, because when I was younger, so from the age of around 12, I was abused by a photographer, by a kind of pillar of the community. And from that point, I kind of went into survival mode. But in my brain, from a very early age, I was always going to move to London. That was my big dream kind of thing. And so when I was 17, the opportunity presented itself through a friend of an ex-boyfriend who lived up this way. And I managed to be able to move up here. But of course, I was moving away from trauma. So the beginning years of moving from that trauma, then arrived up here and then didn't know what kind of healthy relationships were. So I managed to get myself into kind of like quite a violent relationship until I was about 20. From 12 to 20 was really, really fucked up. However, the journey for my recovery kind of was stimulated really by, well, the catalyst for it was getting a job with somebody who is very, very precious to me. Thank goodness I was his PA for 12 years. And he worked with trauma and abused children. So he knew what was going on with me. And I was his PA for 12 years, and he really started to build me up, and he put me on assertiveness courses, and kind of just really, I suppose, saw my potential and tried to grow me. Wow. That led on then to me meeting my husband, which again, well, I was really messed up when I started that relationship, but his healthy way of relating, I could then learn from, and he made me feel super safe. So then my real growth could happen. So from 23, 24, I started having little batches of therapy, some through the NHS, a variety of modalities. And then I started realizing that it was working. And it really, moving into counselling, I had thought about it before, but my friend Tammy, one of my best mates, basically phoned me up and was like, "Oh, I booked myself onto the intro course at West Herts College." And I was like, "Oh, I'll come and do that with you." And I joined straight away without thinking. Wow. And then it wasn't then until I got onto that course did I realise it ignited such a huge passion. Everything made sense. The research I wanted to do, I'd starting to understand how people's brains work, and I just grabbed onto it with both hands and held very tightly.
So for you, going into that intro course, you said you did it without thinking, and I've had moments like that as well, but where I'm doing it before I even realise. So that was a strong impulse for you.
Yes, very. I didn't know where it could take me. I didn't know what kind of what was going to be involved when I actually started the course. And then I realized that, oh my God, there's like 4.5 years worth of training. It's going to cost like thousands and thousands of pounds. I didn't question that, even though money was tricky for me at that point. I didn't question it. I just knew that every year I would sign up to do, to pay my next install, and I would figure it out somehow. Like nothing has ever felt so right ever in my life.
Pretty powerful stuff, eh? That's cool. So how many years ago is it since you first signed up to do that intro course?
12. How old am I now? 40. Oh no, I'm 41 now. So 13 years.
Cool. And you're still going, aren't you? Tell us what about your current study.
Well, because once you qualify, you have to do 30 hours of CPD every year anyway. So you're continuously having to do more courses and specialising. And I think just because obviously my background is trauma, and at one point the PTSD was very heightened. I was having flashbacks and, lots of numbing behaviours and avoidance, and my emotions were all over the place. I was upside down, literally. Because of my recovery through my own trauma, PTSD and traumatology has been a particularly special favourite of mine to work with. I've done other training to understand things along the way. So I've done autism training and, a variety of other different courses, but this one was on my vision board about 2 years ago. And actually, as soon as I qualified, I found this course and knew that this is the one I wanted to be doing.
And what's the course?
It's a level 7 in traumatology and PTSD. So it's like it's master's level, but without the massive dissertation. It's just got a small dissertation in it.
Okay. So just for the listeners and people who don't know, I had PTSD for 20 years and worked with Amanda several years ago now, and haven't had a relapse since. So obviously you already had some tools to help people like me, and obviously having experience helps as well. But tell us what your new study, where that's taking you, and why you wanted to do it, and what potential you can see in it.
Well, I wanted to learn something that was going to be much more thorough. So I've done different pods training on on dissociation and various different types of trauma training. So I've done small courses, but I wanted to do something that would make me an expert in the field, essentially. Weirdly, it's already impacted my practice. What I have discovered is that through doing this training course now, which I'm absolutely loving, it actually just feels much more organised. There's a lot of proper form filling and assessments, and so there's a lot that goes into the initial preparation before you start any trauma work and the safety and stabilisation stuff. Weirdly, some of the techniques that I'm learning, I have learned in other places, but they've been called different things. So that some of the techniques are quite similar to what I learned on an EFT course, for instance. And actually, for my own well-being, what I've had to do to recover fully and stay well myself has been lots of grounding techniques. Safety and stabilization is the stuff that I'm kind of using with people now with this course. Actually, I realize that a lot of the stuff that I've been learning is very natural to me. I've already been doing it, but it might be in a slightly less efficient way.
Okay, that's good. So there's a lot of confirmation for you that you were already kind of doing a lot of these things or heading in that direction anyway.
Yes, and there's a lot of comfort in my learning in that sense, because actually, obviously, the other people that are on the course with me might not have done anything in this particular area, but because I've got a bit of background, of say working with some of the EFT techniques, actually the techniques feel quite natural.
Yeah, that's good. So, I mean, you and I have had many conversations before that have involved both like the very practical, neurological, scientific kind of practices and understandings, but also we talk a lot about the spiritual and the kind of energies and the intuition of things. So, I think it's fair to say, you can disagree with me, but I'm sure you won't. You could say that you're quite interdisciplinary. So how do you see a lot of that all kind of coming together now that you're kind of pursuing like a master's program? Do you see a lot of the kind of alternative things kind of bleeding into the more kind of science and psychology based stuff, and do you think that it validates any of that?
Yes, absolutely. Well, in fact, that was one thing that surprised me the most about it. They've called them different names, but they're similar techniques. But say for instance, the light stream technique is about asking you to feel tensions in your body or body sensations, giving it a size, a color, a temperature, a texture, a sound, making it really tangible, and then imagining a color coming in from above your head and flooding that sensation, and vibrating and resonating around it, and allowing it to change, to change that shape, to help people ground. Now, of course, I wouldn't have put techniques like that in a kind of clinical setting, I suppose. So it's quite surprised me that some of the things that we're doing, there's a lot of visualization techniques, but essentially this all links back to memory and how memory changes when it's traumatized. But actually that whilst we are very intelligent, our brain it can't tell the difference between what's real and what's imagined. So that element of, when we're looking up on a TV screen and we're watching a movie and it's horror, we know we're adults, we know that's not real, but actually our brain is still, our body is still responding in that way. And so things like using the emotional containment, like the internal vault, so where people can, if they don't want to deal with their memories between the sessions, they want to kind of give their brain a break, let their brain process as it needs to, but they don't want things to be intrusive, then using a visualization that would allow them to visualize putting those memories into that vault in their brain, big thick steel, big handle to turn it round, making it really visual. Actually, people really respond very well, but I wouldn't have necessarily thought that they'd be considered clinical practices. So yeah, it's merging hugely.
It's really interesting, and I think there is from my point of view, that the spiritual is only what we experience that hasn't been kind of replicated in a scientific sense yet. And I don't really think that it's particularly out there, to believe in things that you can't see, because we were still experiencing gravity before we knew what it was.
Yes.
And it reassures me some, because obviously we're all prone to bias and being illogical, because we're not created just to be logical. We're emotional before anything else. But it does reassure me that so many of our perceptions that we have before, that yes, this is right and this works for reasons that I can't explain, more and more of these things that were considered alternative or woo-woo are now popping up in the mainstream for very legitimate reasons. And I'm always pleased to hear things like that, because I think, well, we can't dismiss everything that we can't demonstrate yet, because who knows, in 5 years it might be in a paper somewhere or being taught on a master's course.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that, it even says, that with some of these, they don't exactly know why they work, the techniques, they just know that they do, they've been tested. The difference, I suppose, between this course is that what I'm learning on this course is they're all evidence-based So that we're learning 6 or 7 different techniques as well as a plethora of other tools, but they are evidence-based, so they've been tried and tested, which means obviously for me, I can work with the NHS, with the trauma clients, insurance companies, all of that kind of stuff. So it kind of, because it's recognised by the government, it then opens the door for more work. But actually, when you think of like the rewind technique, which is about playing a memory forward in your brain, as if you're in a cinema, having a safe space to start and finish, and then at the end again, and then rewinding your scene, so stepping into the scene and rewinding it back. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, not by much, but that's the process. Who would have thought that will stop flashbacks from reoccurring?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because both that method, maybe not exactly, but loosely speaking, that method and the one of visualizing or connecting to your trauma or that feeling inside your body, giving it a shape and a color and so on, are both things that are present within NLP, neuro-linguistic programming.
Yes, they are very similar. You can see a lot of crossovers.
Yeah, and I find that interesting because, so I trained in NLP in 2018 as a practitioner, and at the time I was dating another trans person who was a doctor of neuroscience and surgery, who was very who heard, we discussed it, and I said, oh, I'm going to go and train and be an NLP practitioner. And this ex of mine said, oh, well, I've looked it up, and it's got no good kind of research or testing to support any part of it. And I said, well, I know for a fact that's not true, but I didn't go to university, and doing research, as I'm sure you can tell us, is quite there's a specific way of going about it. It's not just reading about things, it's the way that you then analyze things that you've read and so on and so forth. And I just, similarly to you, when you signed up to do your intro course for mental health stuff, I jumped at the chance of going to do NLP training, and I didn't even know what it was. And I turned up, and I was all the prep work, I think it was about 50 or 60 hours of prep work I did, listening to this really cheesy American guy on CDs. And I was like, Jesus Christ, what am I doing? And the first day in the classroom doing this intensive course, I was like a duck to water, and it was amazing. And then after that, it was really interesting recently. I haven't used it very much because I've mostly traveled and done other things since then. I have used it a little bit, the NLP. But interestingly, recently I mentioned something to somebody I'm related to. I won't name them, but you'll know who it is. And I said, we were talking about my CV, because I was job hunting, and when I got back from traveling, wasn't sure what I was going to do for a bit. And I mentioned, oh, and of course I'm got my NLP certification. And this person said, well, pseudoscience. And I was like, oh. I was like, all right, I'm well aware of its reputation, but there was no need for that.
Yeah, it's harsh, isn't it? There's so many opinions out there, but actually, I suppose, and with any therapies really to work, it's about the relationship that you've got and the flow that you've got together, and the energy that you create and the safety that you create. And actually, if you've got the relationship, any techniques can be very powerful. Like nothing should be left out.
Yeah, I agree. And in my experience, I could be having a conversation with a friend on a beach, and obviously this is something that I've done, and you can just have this moment, this talking between you, and something just clicks, and it's just, it puts a whole piece of your life just sort of into perspective. It's filed away, and you feel like you're at peace with something, and it can be completely out of the blue. but equally you can go and work with a counsellor that you don't get on with, and it can just make you feel worse. So and nothing particularly positive is gained from that experience. So I mean, I don't know about you, but I do feel that the connection is the most important part over the tools, or however you say that you're going to do it. And with that in mind, I don't know how you would necessarily measure and replicate your results. I'm sure plenty of people out there could explain to me that they have done this and they have thought of these questions before I've said it. But it just seems like such a complicated thing to quantify and analyze, I guess.
Well, I suppose the measurability is often in wellness, isn't it? You know, if somebody comes in looking inside themselves, you know, almost crippled maybe with anxiety, and, you know, if sleep is impacted, food is impacted, you know, if there's unhealthy coping mechanisms, self-harm, I don't know, promiscuity, substance abuse, you know, there's a plethora of ways that it can come through. But or even if it is it's as simple as not feeling authentic to yourself, you know, just knowing that you're not behaving in the way that you want to, or that you're capable of. So then often normally, you know, people suffer a lot because of the fact that they're repressing and suppressing all of their feelings, and actually sometimes just the action of coming to talk means that they're not holding it to themselves, and then it releases that energy from in their body, and they start to see the wood for the trees again. You know, they start to see clearly again. For some people, it can be dramatic within a month or 6 weeks of coming into therapy, actually. You know, you can already have a person at a point of being able to go down to fortnightly sessions, sometimes after 6 weeks, if there isn't any major trauma behind it. You know, if it's about lack of balance, or, you know, or not expressing or not being heard, then actually the changes can be really significant. But they can only be measured by the individual. How much better are you feeling? You know, and often it's that they're feeling a million miles away from where they started. You know, that they might still need to work on self-esteem stuff, but generally, you know, generally they're just feeling in a much better headspace, and caring for themselves better as well.
Yeah. You mentioned about being heard, and that's something that I wanted to bring up today. And you talk about that a lot. And that's something that I come up against a lot in my advocacy work around LGBT issues. And, you know, you often get these people who come along. I mean, it's usually privileged people, perhaps, who don't understand, or it's people from our own community who've said, you know, I've survived this, I'm all right, and nobody helped me, or nobody acknowledged me, or gave me any kind of validation, so why do you need it? And I think that's a really interesting question, but I do feel it comes up a lot when we talk about being heard. And I feel intuitively that it's obvious to me that people do need to be heard and seen, but I can't explain, because obviously it's not my job, but I can't explain why that's important to somebody who maybe doesn't relate to that understanding. Yes, we need to be seen and heard, or perhaps people who, like me, understand it, but we can't explain it or put it into words. How would you explain that, the importance and the emotional necessity for being seen and heard?
Well, I think it's even harder depending on how it's been, how it has come about, what their journey has been like so far. You know, there's so much stigma, isn't there, around the whole issue, really. You know, and then that leads to lots of other behaviours. You know, so it certainly diminishes self-esteem and can increase social exclusion, and, you know, and again lead on to those unhealthy ways of relating. If you don't feel heard, then there's a lack of validation. If your self-esteem is low, do you need to be heard more because you need that external validation? You know, why I suppose, why is it important for some people that to be recognized, rather than some people doing it quietly and just getting on with their own lives and kind of keeping themselves to themselves? I suppose some people need the external validation, possibly, and it might be to do with their past. Maybe they need to be heard and recognized and respected for their choices, you know? Like, I wonder if sometimes it's a part of them being scared to accept themselves in some way. You know, are they recognized and respected for their choices? You know, has that been a part of their past? And if it hasn't been a part of their past, is that why it's so important in the future?
Right. So I guess along those lines, what you could say is that if somebody's been respected and not had to kind of struggle to be seen or heard to begin with, then that's going to be less important when they're coming out. Maybe.
Yes, and yeah, maybe, you know, how it was received, because there is a lack of understanding, you know, and there can be, certainly, from families not understanding, or some families are obviously very supportive, and you know, and they're accepted and they're nourished, in fact, you know, to make the right choices for themselves. But actually, if there has been a lack of belief, is it that they feel like they can't be themselves, or that they're wrong for just being different? And so actually, if they don't feel good about themselves, that they need that external validation to be like, oh, is this choice I'm making for myself okay? Is this what I'm doing, is how I'm coming out okay?
So it's reassurance and it's safety, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, you know, it's obviously very complicated, and I know, obviously, that, you know, different individuals take things to different levels for themselves. You know, some people don't have to transition, you know, across the social standards to be who they really are. You know, some people don't need to make the physical changes. They're happy with the hormone changes, or, you know, I suppose, you know, the whole, everything must be really confusing.
Yeah, it's just very individual.
Anyway,
yeah, I think it's
what you need.
I think it's just interesting, because so often I've seen people comment and say, I don't get it. Why is it important? Why are we talking about this? And, you know, why do you need me? Why do you need me to? And it could be a stranger, it could be somebody you know. And they're sort of like, why do you need me to agree with you? Why do you need me to kind of see you the way that you see yourself? Like, surely that doesn't happen anytime ever anyway. And I find it really interesting, because on the one hand, I think to myself, well, empathy surely kind of would answer that question for you. But then I'm aware that not everyone has access to empathy, or it's not their forte, or they're not even interested in it. And I think my question is, because I think to myself, how do we bridge that gap and bring understanding to people who don't understand the significance of being seen and heard? And I mean, you and I've talked before about relationships, like romantic relationships, and how, you know, not having that understanding, and almost like that that deep connection of I see you. And, you know, so whilst I hear what you're saying about, you know, your past, and if you've never been seen and heard before, then it may be even more important. I'm also thinking about it just from a purely like within relationships, and how that's kind of significant within our relationships generally anyway. Or are we saying that it's purely a mark of emotional neglect that someone needs to be seen and heard, or is it a general
Oh,
human need?
no, I think it's probably a human need. Nobody wants to be, we all want, I suppose, equal rights, and we don't want to have to hide.
Mm.
I suppose if people, does it happen because people want to outwardly show and be accepted in order for them to feel like they don't have to hide any part of themselves in order to be accepted?
Yeah. I've noticed recently, sort of coming from a trauma point of view, that a lot of my posts that have gone viral on, well, I say viral, it's small time viral, not like not like super famous, a post, a lot of it relating to generational trauma and emotional trauma, particularly afflicted on us, or yeah, by parents. Is that something that you're finding in your work, that you're coming up against more and more of that in recent years?
Yes, absolutely. The patterns sometimes do continue, unfortunately. You see it. I suppose, generations have been different anyway, haven't they? Like
Mm,
we're talking about our grandparents and even my parents, really, but grandparents certainly, where emotionally you were to be stoic and not be weak, and kind of hold everything in, and you didn't show anything to anybody else.
mm,
And actually not speaking, not talking about your emotions and stuff like that. It's certainly generational abuse coming through, the patterns repeating, sometimes because of that secrecy. I sometimes wonder how much it would happen if it was spoken about more.
mm,
Uh, and certainly, I think, even from my own personal experience, the the difficulties that my mum had in her childhood, and well, I could really see how they carried forward. I could
mm,
see the comfort eating and the body insecurity and things like that. And I suppose I didn't realise really. I suppose I looked back and thought of my mum as quite prudish, and
mm,
but I suppose you see those patterns and then you learn from the behaviour of the people around you, and then that carries forward. What you keep to yourself is still different, I suppose, in the sense of you can break those patterns and habits and you can choose to be a different way, but sometimes people just go along blindly and carry on those same patterns from generational trauma.
mm. Yeah, and I think part of the difficulty is that for so many of us, we have generational trauma, and yet we are still in contact or connection with our parents. And when it's already, the whole reason that we're in a difficult situation is because we can't talk about our feelings. We then can often feel guilty about being public about, or speaking openly about it, knowing that our parents or that generation are uncomfortable with it. So it's sort of, it's a catch-22. It's like, well, either I can speak about it and start to discharge this power of trauma and connect with others who've had the same
Mm-hmm.
issues, but at the same time I'm then outing my parents or my family with their issues that they already have made such a good habit of not sharing.
Yes, yes, and I think one of the biggest factors to well, one of the most important things, I think, is as well, is realizing that you can't, like, your parents and anybody else around you really has to be responsible for their own growth and journey, that you can't make them
Mm,
see things in a different way just because you're on that journey and your views have changed. That's been pretty tricky for me, to be honest, because I'm like, but this
mm.
makes sense. But yeah, you can't therapy your own family, that's for sure.
No, even if they want you to.
Yeah. Oh yes, it's just not a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about that quite a lot, and I still have this thing. I think being a recovered or recovering codependent, depending on how you look at it, I still find that there's a little element of me that doesn't want to share the things that have affected me, because I don't want people to feel blamed, or that there's any finger pointing, and rather that it's just an expression of something I experienced that has shaped my thinking and my behaviour. And I find that, particularly from the old way of being, that there's very much like a defensiveness, and it's very like accusatory, and it's very sort of, you did that, and I'm the victim, and all that kind of thing. Whereas from my perspective, it's I believe that most of the time people are doing the best that they can, even if that's a terrible job. You know, most people, I think, are not intentional in doing that. You know, it's sort of inflicting trauma or passing it on. And I would say as well that for a lot of people who themselves have been parented by parents with emotional traumas, they're often actually quite many people that I've met have said, "Oh, my parents did this to me, and so I won't do that to my own children." And a lot of the time, they try very hard to do that. But then, you know, obviously the next generation will go, "Well, no, you didn't do that to me, but you did do this, and that's caused its
Yes.
own problems." And
Yeah, of
then you've got the
course.
parent who's gone, "Oh, well, I had a shit time, and then I've tried my hardest, and now you've still ended up with problems, and that's really frustrating and heartbreaking, and I don't want you to tell me that."
Yes. Well, I think though essentially it isn't about blaming, but it is about normalizing. You know, if certain things happened, it's about normalizing how it's impacted your brain and body, really, and your feelings and your emotions. You know, the things that we go through, you know, they impact, they form, they shape the person that we are. But there isn't any point in blaming people in the past, I suppose. You know, you've still got choices that you can make differently now to improve your well-being. I think, you know, taking it into that victim mode of, which is very common, obviously, for people anyway, to bounce around in between victim, persecutor, and rescuer. You know, to bounce around in there, but essentially, we still need to take responsibility for our own actions, and we are still the only person that can fix ourselves and step outside of that and do the things that we need to do to heal.
Yeah, definitely. So, Amanda, you've got a mixture of talking therapy backgrounds, and then also, because in NLP we're taught that every pathway in your brain that you revisit over and over again, you're strengthening that part of your mind. So, for example, if someone suffered one particular traumatic incident and they keep reliving it over and over again, then you're strengthening that habit and that memory and whatever else. But then in NLP we talk about not revisiting, rather diffusing the whole thing. And like you were saying before, with the playing the memory forwards and backwards in a cinema screen and everything, you're breaking the memory, you know, you're discharging the feelings and all that kind of thing. And I wonder if for you there's like you know, how would you go about working out with somebody if they need a talking therapy, or if they need a therapy that avoids them reliving a traumatic memory and dealing with it in a way that doesn't re-traumatize them?
Well, so the whole process of taking, you know, a full assessment at the beginning, a full history, kind of doing lots of diagnostic tools to kind of figure out what's going on, then setting it up to go into the safety and stabilization and grounding techniques and tools and things that they can use to bring themselves down should they re-experience something, you know, during the week. Because of course, when you enlighten memories, then of course your brain says, okay, deal with this now, and throw something else at you, you know. You know, like, well, yeah, you have to trust your brain, you know. Like, you're talking about the reliving of it there in as far as memories coming forward and intrusive, you know, maybe intrusive thoughts or flashbacks in some way, but actually that is the brain trying to get your attention. So once you give your brain what it needs, then actually the flashbacks often subside. You know, those flashbacks and memories inside you are often like your little inner child going, "Oi, pay me attention now." You know, like, you've ignored me for long enough. And because it actually, your brain won't let you keep on doing that once those kinds of signs and symptoms are there. Generally, it will tend to get worse and worse and worse until you deal with it. You know, it's particularly if it's old traumas, because sometimes, obviously, if people go through things when they're younger and they are able to process things properly, then actually it dies down and it's okay. But often we suppress them for years, and then suddenly it comes back and bites us on the arse because our brain's like, no, I'm not going to let you ignore this any longer. So it's you know, kind of vying for your attention. But obviously there are different kinds of processes. There is nothing that you can do to avoid facing it as such, but you don't necessarily need to talk about it. So you might not have to say the words out loud if the words are too triggering, you know, all of that. So which is particularly helpful actually in the case of dissociation and stuff like that, because it can be too much for people. But actually you can dampen down the memories and take the power out of them without having to say those words out loud.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess kind of suppressing your trauma and trying to move on, it takes so much energy to do that, doesn't it? Because you continuously, I can't remember if it was you or somebody else was saying that suppressing things is like trying to hold a blown up beach ball under the water, and eventually you just get tired and it has to come out.
Yes. Well, if you imagine when trauma, any form of trauma happens, you know, whether it's something mild or whether it's something more substantial, that the memory doesn't get filed properly in your brain. So it should go into your long or short-term memory, and actually that trauma memory stays in a walled off area, which is quite fragile. It can be easily triggered, which is why then, you know, certain smell, sounds, you know, things like that can trigger it, make that memory matter very unstable. But of course, pushing it away doesn't make it go away. So then when you face it and you allow the feelings and you you helped people to feel safe and calm whilst talking about that, actually it helps your brain to understand that the trauma has ended. You know, that the difficulty is that sometimes your brain still behaves as though it's still happening. So you're stuck in that traumaed way. But by processing it in whatever way, so whether it's giving it a narrative, whether it's, you know, kind of doing various different techniques, you're essentially helping that unstable memory matter to move into your long and short-term memory. It's allowing it to be filed properly where it should be, in order for you to be able to let it go.
So earlier in our conversation, you talked about one of the methods of having a vault and storing things away in a vault. Is that, given what you've just said, is that like is that a coping mechanism for now whilst you deal with things, or is that something you can do long term?
Yeah, that the internal vault is part of the safety and stabilization that comes before the trauma work, because you can't head into trauma work unless you know that people can cope with the effects of it in between the sessions, that it then doesn't lead on to self-harm, suicide, anything else. So actually, well, even if there aren't particularly destructive forms of coping available, you would still provide this internal vault. You might do a safe place meditation, so you'd take somebody into painting a safe place and stable place for them, essentially for them to be able to revisit and bring themselves back down to earth. You've got to build up their coping mechanisms and their trust in themselves first.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So Amanda, you know this and I know this, that there are so many people out there who have untreated trauma. And I talk to people from all over the world who are from like poor countries, or the USA, where they don't necessarily have like health insurance or good insurance, or they maybe can't get to therapists that are any good, or if at all. Is there anything that people can do to help themselves while they're waiting to get help? Or do you have any tips? Or obviously it's not the same as treating somebody, but are there things that well that helps people?
Yes, there's a few good books, particularly or Pete Walker's From Surviving to Thriving, I would recommend. Quite well, I'm saying easy read. That's because it made sense to me. So I'm hoping it would be an easy read for a kind of non-therapy based person. But Pete Walker's book is awesome. He also has a list of kind of flashback management techniques and tools. Like there's so much research out there, and so many books that you can read. I probably could provide a recommended reading list at some point if somebody was interested. But
sure.
So just taking a hold of your own well-being. If your brain is traumatized, essentially that part of your brain, so the limbic part of your brain, is still scared. So that part of you needs comfort, it needs reassurance, it needs self-compassion. So you have to take lots of different tools from lots of different places. You have to look after yourself well physically, with what you eat, what exercise you do, all of those kind of normal things that you do for your well-being, I suppose. Forms of expression can be very good. So journaling can be fabulous, not necessarily to read back. It can be just a brain dump. So if your brain is trying to get your attention, maybe at night time, or for you to actually put everything down into paper, so that your brain can say, oh, that's on the paper now, I don't need to think about that again. It helps your brain to process and let it go. What are the chances of wellness? Yeah, obviously look at TED Talks. Do a lot of research. Flashback management and grounding techniques can be a must. To help you be able to bring yourself back down to earth when you need to.
Super useful.
Yeah, it's all about well-being and treating yourself with that kindness and compassion. Looking at things like Brené Brown, The Power of Vulnerability, to understand that it's okay to be able to voice your concerns, and it's okay not to feel okay. And
I loved that book. Do you know what? Any time that I've gone through a really challenging and very difficult phase, I always re-listen to the Power of Vulnerability audiobook. And every time it really brings me back down, and also helps me let the tears out. And I always feel better after listening to her. I must have listened to that book about 5 or 6 times now.
Yeah, I absolutely love her. In fact, I've read all of her books now, and I recommend her out to every client that comes, really every client, because people have a difficulty with being vulnerable. You know, it's really hard. There's also Kristen Neff as well. She's a big speaker. Again, she's got TED Talks on YouTube as well. She focuses on self-compassion and the difficulties. And actually, she talks a lot about that we shouldn't be chasing self-esteem. We should be chasing self-compassion. Because actually, if we accept ourselves and we are compassionate with ourselves, then it doesn't matter about the choice, you know, like the where our esteem is at, because we're gonna, even if we cock up, we're basically going to be able to soothe ourselves. You know, that we should be chasing being kind to ourselves and self-compassion, and this just is something that's really hard. Again, generationally, I think, you know, it's diluting as it's heading, you know, as it's in the generation that we are in. But gosh, 50, 60 years ago, self-compassion, good Lord, what was that? You know?
Yeah. Bit soft.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that because, you know, I see that so many more people now are becoming more compassionate generally, and more introspective and more like aware that they're berating themselves, and they go, oh, I've done it again, or I shouldn't be horrible to myself. And
Yes.
you know, I think even if we're not good at it, we are more aware. But I also see as a reaction to people kind of willing to be nice to themselves, even if they've cocked up, or people who are willing to kind of come out of the closet and make the fuss necessary to get the kind of support and be their authentic self. I see this reaction, this really strong reaction to that from often strangers who, you know, I don't know if they begrudge it or they don't want their world to be influenced by anything that they didn't know about before, or is unusual to them. Do you think that is another side of trauma, that people can react to other people living their truth? Or do you think that it's something else?
I think that people are uncomfortable with what they don't understand. And if it questions their beliefs or values, or they just don't know, that they can be scared. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that one.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, obviously, like I for a long time have had an interest in trauma for my own healing, but also because for many years, in fact, from when I was, you know, for 20 years pretty much, you know, family members, people that I've known, loads and loads of people have come to me for advice and help, even when I've definitely not advertised it. And you know, I've ended up being often the counsellor within a dynamic, even when I've not wanted to be. And you know, part of that is that codependency of the thing, you know, you must please other people, and you know, it's part of your reason to exist, to kind of heal this pain and experience and share pain and all that romantic bollocks. But I do now think of a lot of things now in terms of trauma, and I notice that about myself, that any time that I get an interest in something, I kind of reevaluate everything around me with this new lens, and then I'll go off and learn something else, and then review everything around me and all the people and everything with this new understanding. But I have to say that over the years, the trauma is the one that is still very obvious to me, and that's the one that hasn't ever fully drifted away, you know. And you know, how do you feel about trauma and the role that it plays within individuals and all of us relating to each other? Do you see that a lot in everything?
Yes, certainly. Defense mechanisms getting in the way, game playing, you know, not being able to be honest, not being able to speak up and think that you're going to get the right reactions, like being fearing the reactions. Certainly, people not being absolutely congruent and authentic in their relationships for fear of rocking the boat, and needing some stability. So then actually, that really gets in the way then, doesn't it? Because then if you're passive to everything and you're letting everything else carry on alongside you, sometimes those choices aren't what you want, but you're still not speaking up and being heard, maybe. I think sometimes, so obviously the fight flight response means that you have less tolerance, so you are more irritable, there's less a threshold to have to jump up to if you've already got a traumatized brain, to meltdowns, losing your emotions, just not being able to cope and manage. There's very little threshold, so sometimes people can come across critical, just very defensive and kind of aggy all the time. Whereas actually, it's not that they're an arsehole, it's the fact that they've been through something, their protection mechanisms are kicking in, and actually their fight mode is more engaged than maybe their freeze or their flee response.
Yeah.
Their go-to may be getting defensive and, getting the heckles out, because that's what's protected them in the past.
Yeah.
In, like the brain chooses a kind of more popular response, like mine is my freeze response. So if somebody was to come at me, and be confrontational, I just stand there, can't say a bloody word, absolutely stonewalled. My brain won't think of anything to reply. I hold my breath, I can't move, and then they walk away. I mean, not that it happens much these days, to be fair, but they walk away, my body comes down out of the shock response, and suddenly I'm like, oh, I wish I'd have said boom, boom, boom. But our brain chooses the best response for our survival. It's an unconscious response. It just happens. You don't get a choice. Well, of course, if some people's fight response is more engaged, then actually they're going to be seen in a poor light in relationships. Oh, they're so argumentative, they're this, they're that. But actually, it's often a fear response.
Yeah. And I used to be the same. When I was 12, I was very tall. I mean, I've grown, so I'm 6'1.5", and the half is important because my younger sister is a centimetre taller than me, so she's 6'2", and I think that's very naughty of her. I think she should have stayed shorter than me because I'm the oldest. But she, so I'm tall, and I've only grown 2.5 inches since I was 11, so I was a giant child. And I got beaten up at my bus stop at the age of 12 by this girl from another school because she just fancied a fight, I think. And that time there was definitely a freeze response. I was on another plane of existence when that was happening. I knew logically what was happening, but I was very dissociated and removed from it, and in this little dark corner, kind of curled up, and I just heard this little voice going, "It'll be over soon," and it was over soon. And it was okay. And there was a bloke who'd come out of the travel agency next to the bus stop where this was all happening, and he scared off these girls and brought me inside, and they gave me some Dr. Pepper because I was in shock and I needed sugar, and I just dribbled it down my school uniform. And but it's interesting because confrontation scared me for a long time, and then I think it was over 4 years ago I started boxing, and I did that for a year, and I did 2 charity matches, and Amanda, you followed me and did the same thing a bit later, didn't you? But I found that since then my freeze response is pretty much gone, and actually when there's a stressful situation, I feel that I can still access my speech. My anxiety doesn't go up very much. I can still think, because that's one of the things, isn't it, with adrenaline, is that often your ability to communicate gets more and more diminished. So I was always
Yes.
taught that if somebody's getting a bit aggy, you can go, "Oh, mate, sorry, do you have the time on you? What's the time?" And the fact that you've asked them a question, they have to turn a bit of the brain on again, which doesn't work well with adrenaline. So you can actually calm people down by asking them like really inane, mundane questions and bring them back to reality a little bit.
Yes.
Um,
Or you kill it with kindness. In the sense of, if somebody's reacting in that way, whatever the reason is, they're obviously freaking out for some reason. And actually, for you to just stop them a minute and say, "Oh my God, are you okay? You seem really stressed. Are you okay?" Like to turn the concern on again does that. Suddenly they're a bit shocked because they're like, "Oh well, I've just come to have a go." They're a bit shocked about the fact that you
yeah.
are asking them if they're okay.
But do you find that your adrenaline response has changed at all since
Yes.
boxing?
Yes, for sure. I mean, certainly after the boxing, I felt like I could, I could achieve anything. I had faced something that was so terrifying that actually it opened the door to being, well, if I can do that, I can do anything. I think I noticed my freeze response more prior to that, though. I think that the trauma work that I've done has lowered my freeze response. And in fact, I don't get not a lot happens in life now that needs it to come into action, if you know what I mean. I think, I don't know, I know it's still there because I have moments of it, and I still have moments of dissociation here, there, and everywhere. I think I'm definitely stronger in that field now. I get weirdly, my freeze instinct kicks in now. What I've noticed in the last couple of months, weirdly, on video calls. I use it at random, so not individual ones. I've been doing some weekly ones where there's been 12 or 15 boxes up on the window. Weirdly, I've noticed my freeze response kicking in that situation. I have no idea why. I think there is that, or not wanting to talk over everybody, so we're all a little bit like and trying not to, talk through people, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I haven't noticed there hasn't been any reason for my stress response since the boxing, I don't think. Or starting my masters. Oh yeah, my freeze response kicked in then, actually. When I read about what I had to do for a dissertation, oh my good Lord, I freaked out. So I think generally day-to-day things, I'm much more, my freeze response is much better. But I think academically, like with that situation, my fight and flight, well, no, my fight didn't come in. No, so my freeze response did come in because I suddenly thought, oh my God, I'm not clever enough to do this. I'm not academic. I can't. How am I going to do it like this? I just felt like it was impossible. And actually, obviously, since calming down, talking to a few people, actually looking through the work and doing some research on how to write dissertations, I obviously feel okay now. but that initial response and how much I freaked out really shocked me, actually, at that point. At the end of the day, nobody is infallible. There is there's a book called The Myth of the Untroubled Therapist, and and that is about, obviously, that we are human too. It's not like I've sorted all of my stuff and I'm never going to have these reactions again. That's not it doesn't work like that. I catch myself better now.
Yeah, and I think knowledge is power a lot of the time. I've noticed, even in just learning about these things, that me, who's grown up doing the freeze response and trying to stay out of trouble and being very anxious about ticking somebody off depending on what mood they're in, and just being very hyper vigilant. I've always seen myself as very much the freeze response person, I guess, or the keeping myself small. But actually what I've realized upon continued introspection is that actually I'm argumentative, and I didn't know that. And that's actually what fuels some of my anxieties, because in my head I'm imagining people turning up and being like, oh, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, fuck off, I can do what I like. And just having all of these made up arguments in my mind, and me defending myself. And I never knew that I had that within me.
Yes. I mean, why do you feel the need to defend yourself?
This is the thing, isn't it? I can be doing all sorts of things, and I think a lot of it comes back down to the fact that I have quite a traditional household. My parents are a little bit more on the conservative side, I would say, whereas I'm definitely a bit more of a hippie. And I don't know, I do things that make sense to me and feel right, but I just know that it goes so against my upbringing and what I was told was okay. And so I'm sort of defending my choices all the time, and then I have to remind myself that I'm an adult, and the worst that will happen is that people won't like it, and I'll say, well, I love you, but I don't really care that you don't like it, and actually it's not your business, so shut me.
Yes. 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 And maybe again bringing that back to gender, is that actually nobody should feel like they don't belong. And actually, people sometimes feel that this body is mine, but it's not me. And actually you shouldn't have to explain yourself. You shouldn't have to, I suppose you shouldn't. Yeah, you should. I don't know how to say this again. God, I can see it. Well, my freeze response kicks in a little bit at this topic because I don't feel like an expert in it. I think that's yeah.
Could just
well,
be human.
like,
that's enough.
Yes, and then that's it, isn't it? It's just being human.
I wanted to ask just another thing, Amanda, is that we talk about trauma and stuff, and in recent years, I don't have borderline personality myself, but I have a lot of friends who have it, and in recent times I've seen a lot of research that have gone into borderline personality disorder, which it was always said that once you've got it, you've got it. It's just about managing it, you can't get rid of it. However, in recent times they've talked now about borderline being more of a trauma spectrum disorder rather than a personality disorder. And additionally, I know a lady who herself has recovered from BPD, and she I think she had very much textbook classic symptoms, and now she doesn't really seem to have anything like that at all. And she's a coach, and she's healed through mostly alternative therapies. I know you're not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but you've worked already a lot with people who have more complex mental health issues. Do you see that does it seem to you that trauma is the root of a lot of those things, or do you think it's more complicated than that?
I think it is more complicated than that, but I also think that people get misdiagnosed a lot. So I suppose that the first important to mention is that, yes, disorders are on a spectrum. Being provided with a label as such is really just clarifying a collection of symptoms that somebody is presenting with. And so they get given that label as such. And then, so instead of one professional to another needing to say, oh, well, actually, she self-harms, she's suicidal frequently, she's, there's depression in that, all of those kind of different symptoms, they can say they're showing signs of BPD, and then that will be a collection of symptoms that people then know what to work with. Yeah. I also experienced this myself. So before my trauma work, they diagnosed me as bipolar, Because the flips and variations in my day, in an everyday life, I mean, it was bonkers. I was either flat or I was up really high and manically like achieving loads, you know. And so I'd gone, and there was bipolar, or there was something called cyclothymia, which is like a lesser version of that. However, through my trauma work, the peaks and troughs of that normalized, so they came back down within normal range. So now I don't display any, you know, bipolar. It was never that bad, you know. And of course, I know, obviously, I had trauma in the background. My tutor, who's very recognised on the course that I'm doing, you know, around the world really, but she's particularly very big in the UK. You know, does put a lot of these labels down to the trauma. So you never rule out working with anybody with those signs and symptoms, because it can often be trauma. However, I have also worked with people who, you know, having gone through a really thorough history, don't have that history of trauma, and yet have had, say, bipolar symptoms through the roof, you know, doing really, really dangerous things in, you know, foreign countries, and, you know, just really putting themselves at risk. So I've seen both ends, where yes, there's an explanation for this behaviour, and actually through therapeutic work the symptoms can diminish. However, I do think, obviously, that for some people it might be, you know, it might have been passed down again through the family, or I think there are complicating factors that make it be there as a true representation of bipolar or BPD.
Yeah, and actually, I have a friend whose partner is thought to be bipolar, but he, even from me, an armchair psychological enthusiast, if that's the right way to put it, you know, it's easy to see from a mile away that this person is highly triggered all the time, constant numbing behaviors, addiction, you name it. And you know, just even the concept of therapy, or of anybody even peeking inside just with their eyes before they've even said anything to him, is just incomprehensible.
But like you said, like you said earlier, with with how much energy it takes to keep pushing that away, though, is exhausting. So that trauma material that's unstable can be triggered by sights, sounds, smells, words, films, you know, bloody anything, you know, that can be linked. And so keeping that at bay feels is very exhausting. It almost feels impossible. So it depends how long people are willing to live like that for.
Yeah, and I do think that, you know, I think for myself as well, I've gotten to certain points with certain issues that I've had, not necessarily trauma, where my tolerance for it has just disappeared. It's broken. I really got to the end of it, and I literally cannot hold it down any longer. And I don't know, I think the empathetic part of me that's watching this unfold is sort of like slightly cringing, you know, like when you're watching a toddler and you're not going to get there in time, it's about to bump its head on the table, and you're like, oh fuck, that's really going to hurt. And there's part of me that's just, you know, willing people to not bump their head on the table. But I think that's what causes you to realize, doesn't it, that you need to do something about it, or that you've got no choice, kind of.
Yeah. Well, and often that can be the case, is that people often have got so desperate they can't live with it any longer, and so then they come into the therapy room, and they could have come in a long time before that. But actually, you know, everybody's journey is their own, and it's their own timing. and it's when they feel ready for it, and you can't force it upon anyone.
Yeah,
It's
of
not
course.
easy. You know, it's facing the things that hurt is definitely not easy. The therapeutic process is not easy. I remember
No, and it
feeling like
takes.
I was going bonkers.
Yeah.
I literally thought I was going mad when I was in therapy. I was crying all of the time. It flipped me on my head. I felt like I was going mental. But when I came out of the other side of that, I realized that it was just years worth of grief, and it needed to all come out and all be felt. And then at the end of it, I looked back and I was like, boom, you know, I've made it through it, and it was bloody worth it too, because being able to leave the past behind and put it where it belongs, like it hasn't been the arse like that since.
So Amanda, with the conversation of diagnosis and misdiagnosis in mind, are there conditions that, if diagnosed properly, are unrelated to trauma?
Oh yes, for sure. Conditions like bipolar and schizophrenia can be organic, conditions basically. So they can be, they're disturbances basically that could be caused by injuries, so maybe traumatic brain injuries. There could be disease affecting the tissue. There could be chemical or hormonal abnormalities. It could be genetic, so hereditary comes into it. Or they can be triggered by coexisting illnesses or substance misuse and stuff like that. Whereas, BPD and personality disorders and dissociative disorders, they're basically on a continuum of severity in response to trauma, often in childhood. So the more severe the trauma, and the younger you are, and the frequency, and there's lots of complicating factors, but they essentially can make the level of the personality disorders and dissociation much stronger. But yes, of course, there are conditions that that are hereditary, and they're chemical imbalances in the brain.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess with that in mind, it'd be interesting, wouldn't it, to once we're much better at handling trauma socially and medically, how many of those diagnoses will still stand, given what we've talked about?
Yes, well, I think unfortunately that some of the offset of that is that sometimes if people are slapped with a personality disorder label, they just kind of take it, and they might not do anything about it. They're told by kind of professionals, oh, that's it, you've got that, it can't be cured. Whereas actually, if it is a response from trauma, then of course you can do something about it. It is much more difficult with obviously schizophrenia and bipolar, but certainly personality disorders and even just, or if somebody's been, said like I was, misdiagnosed with bipolar, the variations, the highs and lows came down into a normal range. So even if you've got the bipolar diagnosis, and you've got childhood trauma in there, actually going and attacking that with a trauma specialist can change your life.
Yeah, worth a shot then, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's quite incredible, and I have to just say for the listeners that until you said to me, so the story, because you lot like stories. I was in a relationship with an ex-girlfriend. Something started to feel off and feel wrong, but we all thought, myself included, that it was just in my mind, because there was no real reason for me to think that anything was wrong with this relationship. But my intuition was screaming at me, and sure enough, it all blew up, and there'd been some concealing of the truth. And I kind of looked at all of the behaviours of my partner, my ex-partner, and of myself. And I went to Amanda and I said, I've ended up with the same person again. It's me. And then Amanda and everyone else was like, don't be too hard on yourself. And I was like, no, listen, okay, I'm bored of this shit. I want to delve into my brain and pick out every bit of shit we can find, because I am so done with all of this. And then Amanda said, and what about your PTSD? And I was like, well, I manage okay, I think. And she was like, you said, didn't you, Amanda? Well, you can get rid of it if you want. I was like, what? Since when? Nobody told me I could do that. And I was so excited. I was like, why didn't anyone fucking mention this? It's been 20 years. What a fucking piss take. So so sure enough, I mean, we did all of the sort of talking therapy stuff first, didn't we? But then actually did the trauma therapy right at the end, 2 sessions. And I'm not saying that everyone else can do it the way that I've done it, but just I think also this was at the end of many years of therapy and self-help and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, I remember, so we did the main one, the incident for me that happened when I was 9 years old. And I won't share loads of details, but basically it was an adult on holiday with us who just turned up. We were 2 families on a holiday, and this son of the other family, he just kind of turned up. We didn't know he was coming. He didn't stay for very long, and he left. And basically he shouldn't have been left in charge of the kids while the parents were out at dinner or whatever, out for the evening. So, you know, I'd lived with that for a really long time, but I'd sort of acknowledged it. I'd spoken to people about it later in my teens. It all kind of come out. I told my parents what had happened, and I grieved for I think it was about 3 months. I think I cried every day for 3 months after I told my mum, who then told my dad. And so then I was like, well, I've sort of, you know, I guess this is as good as it gets. And I'd mentioned it to other therapists and people, and they were like, oh yeah, fair enough. Nobody was like, do you want any help with that? Yeah, so so we did 2 sessions, and the first session was on this incident that happened when I was 9. And after that, I remember leaving your therapy room, Amanda, and I was waiting, and I even put on the news, and I never listen to the news. Yeah. And I remember, and there was something on the news that I heard. I think I was in a shop or something. I couldn't turn it off. It wasn't my radio. And I heard it, and I literally geared up. I could feel myself like, right, time to get tense now. And then nothing happened. I was like, oh, this is exciting. Fucking hell. I didn't know that could happen. And I was just so excited. And I remember at first I was terrified, and then I was like, oh, nothing happened. You know, and it wasn't like, I had no idea how I was going to feel about those subjects, like sexual abuse and stuff, afterwards. I was like, is there a reset button? How do I relate to that topic after I don't have PTSD? And I've realised that being a sensitive person anyway, or an empath or whatever, I still feel like, oh, that's awful, and it's horrible, and I don't want to talk about it too much, or, you know, I'd rather think about something nice. But it was no longer personal anymore. And just
Yes.
it was just so interesting, you know, when people were talking about things, or I was hearing things, it wasn't happening to me anymore.
Yeah, you weren't being
And
triggered. That memory had moved from unstable trauma memory, and it had been filed where it should have been.
yeah.
And so then it's the triggers, the normal responses don't set your brain into that automatic fight flight response anymore.
I was super impressed. I think of all of I mean, I've had many different therapies, and many different people have helped me, because I was not very functional when I was younger at all. Although I still look back and I think, wow, I had all of that baggage and I still managed to get here. And that in itself is a fucking achievement.
Yes, totally.
But, you know, I do think that particular part of my getting better, like, was really pivotal for me, Amanda, like working with you. And I just really want to say that.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, it was really good. And I think you're the only person who said you don't have to live with it forever. And I was just like, well, fucking, let's do it then. Let's not waste another minute. And you were like, yeah, we have to do some groundwork first. I was like, fuck the groundwork. And you were like, no, we have to. And I was like, all right then. And
Yeah.
then, so yeah, I was just very excited, and I'm so pleased. And, you know, since then also, it's meant that I'm more effective in talking to people about their trauma, because they can share stuff with me. And since then, I mean, you know, I've even had a friend come to me and say, oh, my husband's he's been arrested for talking to somebody online who was underage. And Obviously I won't share who that is or anything, but you know, that for me was like, oh my God, it's come full circle, because I now know somebody who has those
Same
thoughts and
symptoms.
those urges that, you know, was kind of the precursor to my own trauma. And I was like, fucking hell. And you know, I was able then to support my friends, and talk about things very openly in a way that I couldn't have done that before. You know, we could talk very honestly about, like, you know, how to handle these sorts of situations, and I was able to do that and not fly off the handle and not take it personally and not freak out and be like, right, you know, how are you feeling, and what have you been told, and you know, how are you going to deal with this, and as your friend, can I support you in your healing or dealing with your situation? And you know, the earlier version of me before my PTSD was treated, I don't think I'd have been able to cope with that at all.
Yeah, it would have been too triggering for sure.
Yeah, and I do really feel that, you know, for someone to have some personal experience of it and then at the same time be healed from it, you know, that's quite powerful. And sexual abuse and trauma and things like that, it happens, it's happening all around us. So I feel that the more of us that can deal with that and heal from it, and you know, have this really powerful combination of experience and healing, I think that benefits everybody massively, and including ourselves, of course. And I
Yes.
just think that's so powerful, and it's definitely something we should be talking about a lot more.
Yes, I think it goes back to that vulnerability, though, doesn't it? Not being able to, not being afraid to be yourself and show those vulnerabilities. Not that I disclose massively during sessions with people, but particularly, I know for me that the experiences that I've gone through have given me an empathy that you can't buy. You know, you can't get that from anybody anywhere, because you know what it's like to feel anxious, to feel like you're going mad, to feel, you know, really messed up. You know, once you've been to those places, then you can connect with that person sitting across from you beautifully, really beautiful, and it's precious. And actually, that's the whole point, isn't it? We go through these things, we learn what we learn, and actually we've got to pay it forward. Then we've got to pass what we have learned, so all of the different self-care techniques and ways that I have healed, to pass that on to other people, because actually it gives meaning to what I went through as well. You know, it means that I've made something with it. I am now helping people, you know, who might have been in the same position to repair afterwards.
Yeah, and I feel that for me, although I didn't, I've never felt a calling to help people with sexual trauma, but at the same time, I feel that with that experience, I'm able to really know what it's like to go through something horrific. And it wasn't just that one incident, but that I mentioned earlier, that was one of a few, but it was the first. But at the same time, I do feel like I now feel so confident in myself and compassionate about myself, and you know, the shame around that is gone. And so, and I feel that in itself, that's a transferable skill that you can use for all sorts of things. And even just when talking to people, like in my non-binary community and things like that, you know, I think it's important to mention that you can get over trauma, and you don't have to become a trauma specialist.
Oh, totally. Oh God,
Yeah.
Yeah, you haven't got to head down this path.
Yeah. But it is useful for everything. And I feel now as well that I can look at people and I understand exactly why they're reacting that way, because I used to be the same, and sometimes I still do, of course, because I'm human. But yeah, and sometimes, like, people in my life who I usually think are a little bit like abrasive, they could be having some big reaction, and I think, and when I was younger, I would have just been defensive about that. I'd be like, oh, why are you kicking off? Or, you know, fucking calm down, for God's sake. And then, I'm just saying how I feel. And I'm like, yeah, well, shut up. But now that I'm older, I can see them kicking off, and I look at them and I go, oh, I understand what they're doing. And I'm like, mate, are you okay? And they go,
Yes.
no, I'm not okay. And I'm
Yes.
like, I thought so.
Yes. Yes. And all because, I suppose, really, you know, that compassion, that self-compassion that you've learned, you understand that your reactions have come from somewhere. So then you extend that self-compassion outwards then, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. It's really such an important and valuable skill. And it's lovely as well, because what could have been like an absolute car crash of an interaction with somebody turns out to be this really vulnerable, nice thing. And, you know, and you can turn a moment around and you can get people out of their habits, you know. And it might mean that the next time they come and talk to you and they go, oh, I did that thing again today. What's that all about then? And you can go, oh, I don't know. You know, how do you feel? Have you always been like that? And you can just have a conversation with somebody, and it's super healing. I think even just
Yes.
being friends with people and just talking about that is massive, so healing. And
Yes. That goes back to being heard, doesn't it? Being heard,
exactly. Yeah.
you know, not
Yeah.
being rejected, belonging somewhere. Yeah.
Exactly. And I've learned as well, like there's still that codependent part of me that occasionally pops up where someone shares something and I'm like, right, how are we going to fix this? And I go, no, that's not your job. Someone asks you, you could maybe workshop some ideas with them. But what I do now is I listen and I go, mate, that's really shit. You know, how do you feel? Or, oh, you know, I've felt that too. Like, I know how that feels. It's crap, isn't it? And they go, yeah. And normally after just empathizing, I hear you, I felt that, I feel, you know, or whatever, afterwards, so much of the time they go, oh, I feel so much better just for being heard. And I think, there you go, there it is.
Yeah. Boom. And
Boom.
actually that you know, recognizing that you haven't stepped into that drama triangle again. You haven't stepped in as rescuer, which can sometimes skip the other person into victim mode. So,
Yeah.
you know, like actually, because you're stepping out of the drama triangle and being able to let them take responsibility for their own feelings and their own behavior, actually, they too can step outside of it.
Yeah. But so useful. Amanda, thank you so much for coming on to talk about all this stuff. And if people want to find you, where can they find you online?
Yeah, I've got a website, www.amandawellstherapy.co.uk.
Lovely. Are you on Facebook as well?
Yes, I've got Amanda Wells Therapy. I've got a Facebook page. I have got an Instagram account that I really need to that I need to start actually using. That's
I
got
mean,
hardly.
it exists. It's a
Yes,
start.
it exists. Yes, I haven't put much time into it, admittedly. But yeah, otherwise my details are on the counselling directory as well.
Lovely. All right, Amanda, thank you so much. And if I'm sure we'll tap you up for an interview again another time. It's been so lovely to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Transection podcast. Let us know what you think. Tweet us at TransectionP, or you can find us on Instagram at Transection Podcast, or on Facebook at The Transection Podcast. You can also sign up to our mailing list at mooksharrishill.com/transection, and we'll keep in touch with you and send you lots of nice things. Well, not lots, just a little bit. Just a little treat every now and again. Thank you so much, and join us next time when we'll be talking about more interesting and healing stuff. And maybe some more dick jokes next time. Today was potentially a bit tame on that basis, but for some of you that will suit you, because you only put up with us being childish, perhaps because you like the important stuff that we share and you're not so much into the childish bullshit, which is absolutely fine. So anyway, thank you for listening, and see you next time.